Well, good afternoon and thank you so much for having me. Priyan, Jeganathan here, coming to you from Singapore, and very special warm wishes and blessings and prayers from all of us here at the RZIM team globally, especially to all of you as members of the Sydney Tamil Christian Fellowship. The STCF community has been such an important part, not just of my parents' time in Sydney, but also for so many other members of my extended family, so many of our family friends, and so many friends of mine who have been and continue to be members of your community. So it's a privilege and a real blessing to be able to bring this message to you, and I'm so pleased to be able to share with you this short message from Psalm 20, a beautiful psalm of blessing, a psalm of petition and crying out to God in a time of uncertainty and turbulence that very much mirrors the time that we are all going through now, particularly in the context of this pandemic. But a psalm that finishes with this beautiful climax in verse 7 of Psalm 20, where it says that some people put their trust in chariots, some people trust in horses, but we put our trust in the name of the Lord our God. And that's really what I want to be focusing on here today. No matter what you're going through, no matter where you are right now, no matter where you are with God, this is an uncertain and a turbulent season. There's a movie from about 6 or 7 years ago now called The Martian, and it stars Matt Damon, and it tells the story, the fictional story of an astronaut who is stranded on Mars. He's on Mars with man's first mission to Mars, and there is a space station. But in the beginning of the movie, there's an industrial accident, and so his fellow 4 astronauts have to stage an emergency evacuation because they think he has been killed in this accident. And so they stage an emergency evacuation, the base is on fire, and they launch back to Earth. But just as the opening credits are rolling, the camera pans back to this supposedly dead astronaut. And of course, he's not dead. He's the main character of the movie. It's played by Matt Damon. He's a guy called Mike Watney. And the rest of the movie is about how Mike Watney navigates this ridiculous situation, this seemingly impossible situation of being trapped on Mars. He has to regenerate his oxygen supply, he has to grow his own food, and ultimately he has to find a way to make contact with NASA headquarters and somehow get himself back to Earth. Now, the spoiler, of course, is that he does make it back to Earth, and I'm sorry about the spoiler. It's still worth seeing the movie, and it's not really a spoiler because you're not going to cast Matt Damon and kill him off in the first half of the movie anyway. So you knew he's going to make it back. But Mike Watney makes it back to Earth, and in the final scene of the movie, the character Mike Watney is now an international celebrity, and he's a professor at the NASA Academy, and he is speaking to a group of NASA recruits, and he says to them, "It's important that you apply yourself and that you work hard, because when you are out there, you will be presented with a problem, and if you solve it, you'll be presented with another problem, and if you solve that, you'll be presented with another problem." And so he goes on and on and on, and he says, "And if you solve enough problems, you get to come home." That's the final line of the movie. If you solve enough problems, you get to come home. Why have I shared that with you right now? Well, I think it's important because that particular line, if you solve enough problems, you get to come home, that perfectly reflects the message that we give ourselves, that we give each other, and that society out there gives to each of us. And that's really the narrative arc of that movie. The message that it is trying to push is, of course we're going to get into difficult times. It might be unemployment, it might be a medical diagnosis, it might be a pandemic that threatens your job security, it might be mental ill health, struggles with anxiety, struggles with relationships, struggles with singleness if you're single, struggles with marriage if you're married, whatever it might be. And the answer is that we have to dig down deep within ourselves and find a way out. That's the message of that movie, because the whole movie is about human ingenuity, about science and innovation and engineering, and the incredible human capacity to innovate and think and engineer its way out of problems. And all of those things are wonderful things. But the problem is, and we see this perhaps more obviously than we have for a very long time, when we look at this pandemic and its impact on our world, that no matter how hard we try, or how well we apply ourselves, or how sophisticated and seemingly stable the systems are that we build for ourselves, our economic systems, our financial systems, our cultural systems, our emotional systems of support, our systems of geographic people movement, of aviation, of travel, all of these systems are intrinsically vulnerable and unstable. They're all unstable. And one thing that this pandemic has done is that it has shown how unstable they are, because effectively, just in a few months, it's brought them crashing down to a grinding halt. I was reading in The Economist the other day that the United Kingdom, the latest economic data, shows that in this quarter, the latest economic quarter, the United Kingdom's economy contracted by 20% on the previous quarter. Growth contracted by 20% on the previous quarter. That's incredible. The unemployment rates amongst OECD countries is soaring, it's spiking, and it's quite possible that we haven't even seen the worst of this yet. People are still really struggling to quantify what the emotional impacts will be, what the impact on divorce, on mental ill health, on suicide, on anxiety, on depression, on loneliness, on social dislocation. These are all aspects of suffering that are flowing out of this pandemic that are simply uncovering the reality that was always there, that humankind is intrinsically in need, is intrinsically dependent, and is constantly putting its trust in systems and institutions that ultimately are deeply, deeply unstable. And that's exactly what this pandemic has shown us. So I want to talk about 3 things that we need to do in order to find hope in and through a COVID-19 world. 3 things that we need to think about if we're going to find hope in this world that we now live in, this world of uncertainty and turbulence where we just don't know what's going to happen next. And those 3 things that we are all going to need to work out how to do are to navigate instability, to deal with suffering, and to reach out to others. To navigate instability, to deal with suffering, and to reach out to others. And this applies to all of us no matter what we believe. So wherever you are in your walk with God, in your confusion with God, in your struggle with God, or indeed, if this applies to you today, in your rejection of God. All of these 3 things apply to us, no matter what we believe or where we are in relation to God. So firstly, navigating instability. Now, as I've said, what this pandemic has shown us is that all of our systems are intrinsically unstable. They've all been brought to a grinding halt. They've all been brought to a grinding halt by something that we don't even really know how to fight, except through a vaccine, which we're working hard on. But my understanding of the science, having spoken to the epidemiologists and immunologists, is that the nature of viruses is that even if we can vaccinate against this in the short and medium term, it's quite likely that it will mutate. And of course, other viruses will come up anyway. So even that, it's never going to be a win-loss situation. This is not a binary pre-COVID, post-COVID world. The world will never really be the same again in the same way. And we see that in history as well. We saw it after 9/11. The world has never really been the same. So much has changed in geopolitics, in airport security, in travel regulations and so forth. It's going to be the same thing after this. So this instability is here with us to stay. There's an American sociologist by the name of George Ritzer, and he talked about this cultural phenomenon called McDonaldization. And he coined this, of course, in the 50s and 60s when the McDonald's fast food chain was really taking off. But in using the word McDonaldization, what Ritzer was really talking about was how modern society increasingly is all about immediate satisfaction. Very quick to get what it wants. Drive-throughs. When's the next iPhone coming? When's the next click and collect? How quick can the Amazon Prime delivery get to me? We're increasingly moving pretty much from the 50s and 60s through the computing revolution to a world where people just want what they want now. And they want certainty about what they want, and they want to have it when they want it without any problems. And Ritzer identified 4 aspects of this thing he called McDonaldization. And those 4 things were this: efficiency, predictability, calculability, and control. So things need to be efficient. They need to move smoothly. Things need to be predictable. We need to know what's going to happen. Things need to be calculable. We need to be able to calculate and quantify what's happening in the world around us. And control. We need to be able to control it. Now, most of us listening to this message, including myself, are Eastern in our background. We are from the subcontinent. And even if we grew up in Australia or in a Western country, we're very much Eastern in our, certainly genetic, but also our psychological makeup. We've grown up in Eastern communities, in Eastern cultures. And those 4 things, efficiency, predictability, calculability, and control, are right at the heart of the Eastern heart and the Eastern mindset. We are constantly telling ourselves and our children that you've got to minimize risk, mitigate against risk. Just study hard, apply yourself, and study the safe stuff. Study the things that will get you a safe job, that will get you social and professional prestige. And that's why so many of us wind up as doctors and lawyers and engineers and accountants, because this is part of the outworking. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it is interesting that it's part of the outworking of a low risk, high certainty, high predictability culture. We don't like the idea of uncertainty. And now, this is not just a subcontinental thing, and it's not just an Eastern thing. It's very much a human thing. But I feel like we, as a language group and as a culture group, we embody this perhaps more so than many others. Here in Singapore, where my wife and children and I live, we see a lot of this kind of Eastern thinking, this yearning after efficiency, predictability, calculability, and control. We like to know the answer. We like to know what's going to happen. We like to plan for the future. The problem is, of course, that what this pandemic has shown is that sometimes the storms can come out of nowhere. And when they do, our boats are really small. When the storms come, our boats can seem really, really small and incapable of dealing with what these storms actually can bring for us to deal with. Now, there is a term that economists and behavioral scientists use called black swan. And many of you will know, you might have read the book by Nicholas Nassim Taleb, but this has been vernacular for a long time now. A black swan event is an event that you don't see coming. It's a surprise. It comes out of nowhere. And so the Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis in 2007, 8, 9, 9/11, this pandemic, they've all been referred to by various kinds of experts as black swan events that you just couldn't expect and you couldn't predict. Now, when we look through human history, we think that we can predict most things, right? Right from the weather through to politics, to economics, to what is happening next, we think we can predict it. But when we look through history, and I've just named some of them for you now, black swan events are actually much, much more common than we realize. In fact, these days, almost every swan is a black swan. Now, the reason we call it a black swan is in the North Atlantic, in Europe, continental Europe, the United Kingdom and the United States, where a lot of this kind of scholarship was done, most of the swans there are white. And so black swans are relatively rare in those parts of the world. And so that's why they use the term black swan for an unpredictable event. But I grew up in Perth. And in Perth, all the swans are black. In fact, we have so many black swans, we named our river after them. It's called the Swan River. So growing up in Perth as a high school student, I was always very confused about this term black swan event. When I'm studying economics and political philosophy and they talked about black swans, I don't really understand. Funnily enough, today, the Perth paradigm of thinking is much more accurate than the global paradigm of thinking when it comes to black swans. Because today, in our world, just like has always been the case in Western Australia, almost all the swans are black. Black swans are everywhere. These unforeseen events are everywhere. They're around every corner. So the question then becomes, how do we navigate through this instability? How do we find hope? How do we find certainty amidst the uncertainty? And the psalmist is very clear on this. He says, very, very upfront, he says, some people put their trust in horses and some people put their trust in chariots. That's the tendency of the world, to put our trust and our hope and our stability in systems and institutions that we think we can predict, right? Where we go to school, where we go to university, where we get our job, what we're going to do when we retire, what's our superannuation account like, how many extra houses have we bought, have we saved up for our children's wedding, have we got enough money for the next car that we need to upgrade our car to. All of these things are us misunderstanding the prevalence of black swan events. We think that we have control over the world and over the system. We think that our systems are predictable, our economic systems, our financial systems, our political systems, and we think even internally our emotional and psychological systems are all predictable and calm and able to be calculated. But one thing that this last 6 months has shown us, amongst many others, is that all of these systems are not predictable, that these horses and chariots that we have been putting our trust in and putting our hope in are not going to cut it amidst the instability. What we need is an anchor outside of the instability. We need an anchor outside of the storm. And when you think about it, that's the only way an anchor properly works. You need to attach it to something outside of the storm. There's no point having an anchor if it's sitting in your boat with you. It just becomes just as subject to the storm as you are, as your boat is. In order to properly find stability and navigate through it in the midst of a storm, you need to attach that anchor to something outside of the storm. You need to attach it to the ocean bed, or you need to attach it to the land. And that's what this psalmist is talking about in verse 7b, where he says, some people put their trust in chariots, some people put their trust in horses. We put our trust in the name of the Lord our God. Someone who is ultimately dependable, who is ultimately stable, who is ultimately predictable, who is ultimately not fazed by the black swan events, because no black swan event is a black swan event to God. He's all-knowing, he's all-powerful, he's all-sovereign. He knows what he's doing, and he knows what he wants for us. So navigating instability depends on us turning to the person of Jesus Christ, where we can find that stability. That's how we can navigate through instability, is by putting our trust not in the things in our world, not in creature creations, as Charles Spurgeon says, but in the heart of God himself, in the character of God himself, in the invitation to relationship with God. So that's how we navigate through instability. That's how we find hope amidst instability. We put our hope, we put our trust in something outside of the unstable system. Secondly then, dealing with suffering. How can we deal with suffering at a time like this? And in fact, how can we deal with suffering at any time? Suffering is ubiquitous. It's something that everyone has to deal with, no matter whether you're a Christian or not. Suffering is something we all have to deal with. And when you look at the different worldviews out there, you begin to see some interesting ways of approaching and responding to suffering. There is one particular category of worldview or religion out there that says that yes, God does exist, but he doesn't really care about you or your suffering. In fact, he's all powerful, he's all sovereign, and if he wills for you to suffer, that's just too bad. You just need to shut up and take it. There's another category of worldview that says that your suffering is your fault because of something you have done in this life or perhaps a previous life. That's why you're suffering. That's the reason for your suffering. And so everyone is directly responsible for their own suffering. And once again, they just have to shut up and take it. There's a third category of worldview that suggests that suffering is an illusion. It's not even real. It's because you care too much, because you desire too much. That's why you're suffering. You love your family. That's why when you lose a family member, you suffer. You love your job and you dedicate yourself to your job. So when you lose your job because of the economic downturn, because of COVID, you suffer. And so the solution of this worldview to suffering is that you need to meditate yourself to a point where you don't desire anything anymore. There's no more desire. There's no more connection. And therefore you won't suffer. You basically have to meditate yourself to a mindset of nothingness, where your whole consciousness is completely extinguished, where you literally extinguish the self. And then there's the fourth category of worldview, which are the atheistic worldviews that says there is no God. And if they are being honest to themselves, they say that suffering is meaningless. And they have to say that because if there is no God, then everything is meaningless. We are just time plus matter plus chance. And as Richard Dawkins, one of the most prominent new atheists, says, in a world where there is no God, some people are going to get lucky, some people are going to get rich, some people are going to get poor, some people are going to get raped, some people are going to get killed, and there isn't any real rhyme or reason to it. All we would expect is blind, pitiless indifference. And so suffering in that sense is meaningless. Now, I look at those four worldviews. One that God doesn't care and you just have to take it. One that says it's all your fault directly in this life or a previous life. One that says it's because you desire too much. You have to meditate yourself out of all connection and cut off all your connections. And fourthly, the worldview that says that suffering is meaningless. And for me, they fail intellectually and they fail experientially. They fail to compel my mind or my heart to dealing with the suffering that I have seen and that people around me have had to deal with. And so the human heart yearns for a better response to suffering than all of those things. Something better that we can put our hope in, something more compelling that we can put our trust in. Because every human heart desires two things amidst suffering. We all desire comfort and strength in the midst of the suffering, and then we desire some kind of a hope for a future where there's no more suffering. So we desire comfort and strength within the suffering, and then some kind of other side of suffering, some kind of restoration or redemption beyond the suffering. We look at these four categories of worldviews and they fail to deliver that. And then we look once again at the person of Jesus Christ. And in him we see a God who doesn't say your suffering is meaningless, or it's none of your business why you're suffering, just shut up and take it, or it's all your fault directly. No, he says, I love you. I understand that your suffering is real. I know that the world is broken and you are broken. And so what does he do about it? This God, he steps down into our suffering as a person. He literally steps into our suffering as a person and then takes all of that suffering onto himself and does away with it, defeats it on a cross, takes the penalty for all of that brokenness, all of that suffering, all of that anxiety, takes it all onto himself, does away with it, is then raised from the dead, thereby affirming who he is. Jesus Christ, the Son of God himself, God, man, together in one person, rises from the dead, and now, through him, we have the opportunity for an up-close and personal relationship with him, through which we get the exact two things that every human heart is looking for in the middle of suffering: comfort and strength within it, and an eternal future where there is no more suffering at all, where we actually get to be with God who saved us from it in the first place. It's a unique and a powerful and a compelling response to suffering that is more relevant now perhaps than ever before in living memory, probably since the end of the Second World War. This response to suffering, this cross of Jesus Christ, arguably the most powerful and compelling and redemptive response to suffering in human history. And it happened literally in human history 2,000 years ago. There is evidence for it, that this God came into the world and suffered for you. And now if you are willing to take his hand, he is offering to suffer with you. He doesn't say, let's try and ignore it, let's try and go around the suffering, let's try and avoid the suffering. He says, no, take my hand, we are going through it. I have been there before, it's going to be okay. So through the person of Jesus, we see that we have an anchor through which to navigate uncertainty, and we have a redemption, a comfort, a strength, and a rescuer through which to deal with suffering. Thirdly and finally, what else are we called to do at a time like this, a time of such uncertainty and turbulence? We're called to reach out to others. And that's part of the uniqueness of the Christian message. It's not just about navigating instability ourselves or dealing with suffering ourselves. We are also called to take this love of God that we have running through us and to pour it out on the lives of others. Because no matter how much you are suffering, there are always people around you who are suffering too, likely that are suffering more than we are. And so we are called in the name of Jesus to pour out the love of Christ onto him. And one of the best examples of this, just from your STCF community, is one of these projects, these farm projects that you are running, where you are providing resources, cows, economic resources, financial resources to otherwise struggling communities in Sri Lanka. And various other projects similar to this that you guys have engaged in over the years. That is an example of you reaching out to those who have been left behind by society. These systems and institutions that have been ground to a halt by the COVID pandemic, they've been failing some people for a lot longer than just the last 6 months. And these are the people that we are compelled to reach out to. And we see it throughout the scripture. We see it in Isaiah 58, we see it in the entire book of Amos, we see it in so many of the early prophets, we see it in Matthew chapters 5 through 7, we see it again and again and again, more than 2,500 verses in the Christian Bible on reaching out to those whom society's systems and institutions have left behind, reaching out to the oppressed, reaching out to the disadvantaged, reaching out to those who are struggling amidst this pandemic. Maybe they're struggling in very visceral ways. Maybe they've lost someone to COVID-19. Maybe they've lost a job as a result of COVID-19. Or maybe they're just struggling. Maybe they're just struggling emotionally. Maybe they're struggling mentally. Maybe they're just struggling with meaning in their life with all of these systems of ground to a halt. When COVID first hit and we all went into lockdown in kind of February, March, April, there was really a sense of meaninglessness and suffering that people had to deal with. That has now shifted somewhat into a sense of disillusionment. People are now just kind of confused and a little bit despondent and frustrated with the fact that we haven't gotten through this yet. Well, the reality is that this despondency, this disillusionment, and even the suffering and the existential struggles from earlier on, they're not new. They're not caused by COVID-19. They're just revealed by COVID-19. This pandemic has not caused anything new. It's just revealed the struggles that have been on human hearts for a long time already. And we are called to reach out with the love of God, which is qualitatively different to the love that you find in the world. In the world, we know that love is important. You don't have to be Christian to know that love is important. It's in every song, it's in almost every movie, it's in poetry, it's in literature, it's in everything. Everyone's writing about love. The Black Eyed Peas, where is the love? The Beatles, all you need is love. Again and again, every chart topper has got something to do with love. So what's the problem? The problem is that all we think about is the quantity of love, not the quality of love. And the world out there will tell you that what you need is more love, more love, more love. They think the problem out there is a quantitative problem. But when we look in the Bible, we see that the problem is a qualitative problem. The problem is not that we don't have enough love. The problem is the kind of love that we think we need and the kind of love that we do need. We are not capable as human beings of generating it in our own strength. When Billy Graham met with President Dwight Eisenhower, Eisenhower was trying to encourage him, and so he said, "Billy, I hope your crusades in New York go well that are coming up. Wouldn't it be great if we all just learned to love each other again?" And Billy Graham smiled and he said, "Yes, Mr. President, it would. But we can only love in the purest sense if our hearts have first been touched by the love of Jesus Christ." Of course, we should all try to love each other again, but we can only love in the purest sense if our hearts have first been touched by the love of Jesus Christ. This is a qualitatively different kind of love. And we can reach out with that love right now. We can pour that love out onto those around us. Yes, onto our friends and onto our families, onto our church communities, but also onto those beyond those communities who are struggling and suffering. And this is a wonderful way to demonstrate and to show the love of Jesus. Navigating instability, dealing with suffering, and reaching out. All three find their source and their propulsion in the person of Jesus Christ through up close and personal relationship with him. Some put their trust in chariots. Some put their trust in horses. We put our trust in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Can that be said of you? Can you look in the mirror? Can you look at God right now and say that truly? Until and unless you do, you'll be struggling with uncertainty. You'll be struggling with suffering. And you'll be trying to reach out to others with a human, man-made love rather than the unstoppable supernatural love that flows from the heart of God himself. It's interesting that in The Martian, that movie, they're trying to build this whole idea that all we need is what we've got inside of ourselves. Dig deep, apply yourself, innovate, study hard, work hard, and everything will be okay. Even in the fiction of Hollywood, they couldn't make that narrative hold. Because how does this character get back from Mars to Earth in the end? He doesn't do it himself. He's rescued. Even in a movie where they made up the story, trying to build an underlying narrative message about human self-sufficiency and independence and strength, they couldn't even do it. He had to get rescued. They had to come back and get him. That's how he made it back to Earth. They rescued him. In the same way, you and I need rescue too. Our families need rescue. Our cities need rescue. Our society needs rescue. And it needs a qualitatively different, transcendent form. And that form can come only when we understand what God did in coming into the world as the person of Jesus Christ. Navigating instability, dealing with suffering, and reaching out with a supernatural love to others all requires one thing first, that we are in right relationship with God himself through the person of Jesus. I encourage you, if you have not made that choice, or if you have drifted from that choice, to recommit to that today. The world needs you more. Your community needs you more to understand that and to live that truth out, perhaps more so now than ever before. Once again, God's blessings to you. Our best wishes from RZIM to you. Take care of yourselves. Look forward to seeing you all in person as soon as the Lord wills it. Take care and God bless.